Thank you, Hugh. It's really great to be back here at the Nixon Library, and also to see so many friendly faces in the crowd. I guess that means I'm home, so I like that. Thank you all for coming. Like many Americans, I was taught that the only thing worth knowing about Richard Nixon was Watergate. In school, we didn't cover the upheaval he started in American foreign policy. We never learned, for example, that in less than 2 years, Nixon ended the Vietnam War, opened relations with China, laid the groundwork for Israel's peace with Egypt, and weakened the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe, not far from where I live today. How Nixon achieved such stunning results in foreign policy is history worth teaching, because it resonates for us today. Caught in the tragedy of Vietnam, Americans had split into two ideological camps: those who wanted America to renounce its global leadership, and those who wanted to expand the range of America's military engagements. It was left to Nixon to find what Henry Kissinger described as a third way between abdication and overextension. He decided that there was a sound principle that could guide the United States in the midst of the Cold War, while reconstructing the public support that was lost in Vietnam. That principle was the national interest. What would have been common sense in most other societies, the national interest was a difficult concept for a people as idealistic as Americans. Americans had long been intoxicated by the belief that the arc of history bends towards justice, that regardless of national histories, traditions, and values, all societies eventually transform into democracies and market economies. Ever since Woodrow Wilson, Americans had grown attached to the idea that the United States should make the entire world safe for democracy. For Wilson's ideological descendants, the only question was whether the United States should administer the inevitable by actively intervening or by simply getting out of the way. But this type of missionary foreign policy makes two costly mistakes. The first is the assumption that all foreign societies must eventually reflect the American model. The second and more dangerous mistake is that American foreign policy does not necessarily need to match our political, military, or financial capabilities. Nixon watched both mistakes lead the United States to a total rupture of social cohesion at home. In his first annual report on foreign policy, he broke with the tradition. Quote, "Our objective in the first instance is to support our interests over the long run with a sound foreign policy. The more that policy is based on a realistic assessment of our and others' interests, the more effective our role in the world can be. We are not involved in the world because we have commitments. We have commitments because we are involved. Our interests must shape our commitments rather than the other way around." American politics had become a struggle between those who wanted to retreat from the world and those who wished to expand our interventionists. Nixon offered a third way, based on the national interest as the core motivation of U.S. foreign policy. But Nixon failed to realize that America is, at its core, an idealistic society motivated by the promise of a better future. We believe that the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are endowed to all human beings, not just to the citizens of one particular country. A cold, some might say ruthless, foreign policy based only on the U.S. national interest failed to establish an emotional connection with a people reared on hope. Any lasting change in foreign policy must, like the American people, have a strong moral center. Without that, Nixon was unable to lead an enduring change in foreign policy. and the catastrophe of Watergate ensured that even his achievements would be obscured by history. Until a few years ago, it had been several decades since the United States had placed the national interest at the core of its foreign policy. In an attempt to replicate Reagan's moral victories without possessing his strategic insight, the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations learned too many wrong lessons from the end of the Cold War. In fact, they made the same mistakes Americans had made a generation before. They wrongly assumed that the increase in the number of democracies in the world was both inevitable and irreversible. And they believed that the new era of democratization eliminated the need for old concepts such as the national interest, geopolitical competition, and the balance of power. As a result, we spent another generation making foreign policy on the basis of moral and political maxims without really considering the U.S. national interest or maintaining stability in the world's most vital strategic theaters. Thus, we counted on elusive transitions to democracy. We conducted humanitarian interventions without regard for the inevitable humanitarian fallout. We signed resolutions and protocols we never had the ability to implement. And we committed ourselves to war without a clear understanding of the threat we faced or the outcomes we could realistically achieve. An experience which, as U.S. spokesman to the UN during the first 5 years of the Iraq War, eventually convinced me that a costly military engagement without a clear benefit to the American people creates deep political divisions. Today, we see the consequences of some of these mistakes. With Russia, we see the costs of assuming that the fall of communism was a permanent moral triumph, rather than a temporary strategic victory that required constant tending. With China, we see the chaos of believing that integration into the global order and participation in international institutions like the World Trade Organization makes all regimes responsible stakeholders. With Iran, we are watching the consequences of treating nuclear proliferation and economic sanctions as if they could be separated from the spread of terror and the regional balance of power. For decades, the Washington establishment made foreign policy without the national interest at its primary concern, and then apologized to the world rather than to the American people when its policies failed. By 2016, the American people had grown tired of being told the national interest was an immoral consideration. Then came President Trump. We hear a lot about nationalism and what the word does or does not mean. At times, the word has been manipulated for personal gain and deployed as a political weapon. But nationalism, or the national interest, does have a specific application to foreign policy, summed up by what I'll call the Trump Doctrine. It actually represents the marriage of strategy and moral clarity that eluded Nixon. Let me begin to explain that by offering a definition. The Trump Doctrine puts the security and prosperity of the American people before everything else. There are, of course, other important goals of our foreign policy, such as human rights and democratization. But none are pursued at the expense of our national defense and economic well-being. In other words, the President of the United States works for the American people. That's the Trump Doctrine. It's that simple. It is the pursuit of the U.S. national interest without pretext or apology. Now, as I said, this is not just a sound basis for foreign policy. It is also a moral foreign policy. And let me tell you a few reasons why. The first is that it is a pure expression of representative government. It places above all else the interests of the sovereign and self-determining American people. The second, it forces policymakers to be clear-eyed, to see the world as it is, not as they think it ought to be. Moving the world toward greater freedom and liberty is and always will be an important goal for the American people. but the Trump Doctrine forces policymakers to align our objectives with our capabilities, to match our goals with what is truly attainable in the world in which we live. If you wonder why that's moral, ask yourself this question: how can America create more wealth and opportunity in the world? By trying to transform the internal structure of foreign societies, or by trying to grow our economy at 4%? The third reason, an honest admission of our national interests in fact makes our foreign policy more stable. A foreign policy based on the national interest, reasonably defined, is more durable and more predictable than one based on the passions and furies of the moment. The fourth reason this is a moral foreign policy is that, as Secretary Pompeo said recently, America first does not mean that America succeeds at the expense of others. It means we succeed to the benefit of our people and, by extension, the nations that share our values and our strategic goals. This is exactly right. By openly pursuing our interests, the United States can build consensus among other countries whose interests reflect similar ideals and objectives. America first does not mean America alone. Indeed, America's alliances are one of our greatest advantages in an era of renewed geopolitical competition with China and Russia. That is the basis of our policy with regard to Europe. Because the United States and Europe share the values of security, peace, and free trade, we ask our European partners to share the burden of transatlantic security. We expect them to cut rather than grow their dependence on Russian gas, and we want them to renegotiate trade agreements to make our relationship more balanced and fairer. Notice that we are not asking China or Russia to increase their defense capabilities. We are asking our friends. The United States wants Europe to become a political and military power because we are confident that our shared values will provide the fuel for that power. As the largest economy and de facto leader of Europe, Germany will ultimately decide the strength of NATO and thus of European security. It is for the sake of Europe's security that we hold German partners to their NATO obligations. Likewise, when President Trump reviews America's security arrangement with Japan or trade relations with India, it is not because he questions the value of our partnership with those two great allies. On the contrary, it is because he wants to encourage our Indo-Pacific partners to become more confident and to play a more active global role in defending our shared values. Whether they admit it or not, those in the establishment who criticize this approach advocate for keeping our allies subdued and passive. President Trump does not believe that American or global security will benefit from keeping nations which share our interests in a position of perpetual dependency. It is only by having nimble and outward-looking allies that the United States can continue the role of global superpower effectively. For those countries which do not share our values and goals, President Trump is not waiting around for the arc of history. He does not make regime change a precondition for negotiations. Instead, the president is determined to outcompete our adversaries. But he's also willing to cut deals where Americans and global security will benefit. He is incentivizing our adversaries to change their behavior, not mobilizing to replace them. You're watching this policy play out in real time with China, Iran, and North Korea. The strength of the U.S. armed forces, the dynamism of our economy and financial system, the dollar's unchallenged role as the world's reserve currency, and the revolution in our energy production all combine to give the United States a new era of leverage in global affairs. This is what allows President Trump to pursue a dual-track approach, using the stick of economic pressure while offering the carrot of negotiations without preconditions. This is also why President Trump has removed the limits imposed on American power by moralistic agreements and institutions which do not advance our interests. American power should first and foremost be used to bring our adversaries to the negotiating table, even as we maintain the most credible and formidable military deterrence on the planet. In my view, this is the Trump Doctrine, and this is what, in the real world, a moral foreign policy looks like. When our rhetoric surpasses our resources, when our policy exceeds our capabilities, when our expectations cloud our judgment, and when our desire to remake the world overtakes our duty to the American voter, that is when you get pointless and costly wars. That is why when you send America's sons and daughters into harm's way without a plan for what comes next, that is when you make disastrous trade deals and sign dangerous nuclear agreements. That is when you get massive inequality and a divided society. That is when you get an immoral foreign policy. That may seem counterintuitive to some of our friends in the elite, but I believe it is common sense to the American voter. The national interest, or as the president says it best, America first, is simply the best means of ensuring the security and prosperity of the American people, cooperating with those who share our values, and outcompeting our adversaries. It is the best way to retain public support, without which no foreign policy can survive for very long. And it is the only way public support can be legitimately called upon when, as does happen in the course of our history, we are locked in a confrontation which we must use all of our power and strength to win. The Trump administration's ability to defeat ISIS without a large use of boots on the ground, without triggering a conflict with Russia, and without causing a new wave of terror is proof that this strategy works. And it salvaged the public support that our predecessors lost in Libya, Syria, and Iraq. Now the critics of this strategy have called it everything from nativist to isolationist to fascist. So I'd like to close with a few words about what the Trump Doctrine is not. It is not based on any race or color or creed. It does not advance the interests of one group of Americans at the expense of another. It has no bias with regard to red versus blue or urban versus rural. It is not a doctrine based on class or status, nor does it aim to please the members of a professional elite or the Washington establishment. On the contrary, the Trump Doctrine is the belief that our government must focus on the equality and dignity of every American, from Maine to Hawaii, Texas to Minnesota, Oregon to Puerto Rico, and that this obligation is fulfilled by promoting the security and prosperity of the American people, not by pretending to promote the interests of all humanity. To me, this is America first. This is the Trump Doctrine. This is American exceptionalism for the 21st century. As groundbreaking as it is in our time, President Trump has drawn on a great tradition in American foreign policy. Think of Washington's warning against foreign entanglements, cautioning us not to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the storms of foreign upheavals. Think of Teddy Roosevelt's caution that it would be both foolish and an evil thing for a great and free nation to deprive itself of the power to protect its own rights. Or think of John Quincy Adams, the first American to hold the office I currently occupy, who said that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy, but is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. We would have done well to heed these words in years past. Luckily for all of us, now we are. Thank you, God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
Mr. Ambassador, for the benefit of our friends in the back, about an hour ago, I want to make a little news. Ursula von der Leyen of Germany, the defense minister, was elected the European Union new president, European Union Commission's new president. Do you have a reaction to that and what it portends for Germany and for the EU?
Thank you for that. I know you want me to make a little bit of news. Maybe I'll try not to, but I know Ursula von der Leyen very well. She's the current defense minister. Congratulations to her on being elected. I think it was a hard election, very close. I think that America benefits, and I'll tell you why, is that she fundamentally understands the United States. She appreciates the United States. I'm grateful to her commitment to the transatlantic alliance. I think it's a big job, and she's got a lot of diverse groups to now deal with. It's going to be difficult. She's going to adjust, I think, her positions. She's going to have to in order to keep the Europeans together. It's a big challenge. I will say that creates a little bit of space in the German cabinet. There'll be a new defense minister, and that may be a good thing because we are pushing hard on the 2% issue, as you know. The Germans committed, the current German government, the current coalition government between the CDU and the SPD are the ones who signed the commitment to NATO, and they're the ones who are currently in office. So there should be no reason why they can't get to 2%. We're struggling to have leaders come out and say 2% by 2024. At this point, I would take 2% by 2026 or 2028. Just give us a plan to get there, and I think that's what NATO wants to do, is see a plan. So we need to push the Germans continuously. I think it's a pro-Europe position to be for NATO. There are 34,000 American troops serving in Germany, and I think that the reality is that the American public, the American people are getting frustrated that the largest economy in Europe, the German economy, is not paying its 2%, its commitment to NATO, and that's got to change.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador Grenell again, and thank you for coming today.